That's super distracting. But anyway, thank you for having
Always.
me. And thank you for all of these spaces that have shown up. I know some of you and I don't know all of you. And I'm particularly appreciative to the friends of mine who I emailed last night to say, hey, if you're interested, show up. And some of them actually did. So thanks to all of you. I'm also really appreciative, as I said to Adrian earlier, for the opportunity to sort of revisit this story. I actually reported it almost a year ago at the very beginning of the pandemic, when people still thought that they were going to be able to travel from the US to Poland last summer. And, you know, a lot of that didn't happen. But it was written for B'nai B'rith magazine, which happens to have very, very early deadlines. So I filed the story in late summer and it was published in December. So I had to, in preparation for talking to you all tonight, I sort of went back and reviewed my notes and I made some new notes, and I have my copy of the magazine right here so that I can refer to it, just to refresh my memory. So with that caveat, oh, and I also want to say we had hoped that Dr. Myrna Tech was going to be able to join us tonight. She was actually the impetus for this story. She is a local Silver Spring resident whose ancestors are buried in Poland. And the story was generated by her efforts to restore the cemetery where her ancestors are. And so that's how we sort of learned about all of this and got it started. Unfortunately, she had a conflict tonight. She's actually chairing a group that works to restore cemeteries, and they were having a meeting that happened to be at the same time. So I will try to fill in for her. And I'm going to start by recounting the anecdote that I opened the story with, because I found it really striking and I think it sort of sets the scene for the story. This came from an interview that I did with Peter Pukta. He is the director of an organization in Poland whose mission is to restore buildings from Jewish institutions in Eastern Europe, and that includes cemeteries. So I interviewed him and he told me this anecdote. Imagine a bunch of workmen who are using bulldozers to level a field in Poland. It's a wide open field and they are trying to level the ground so that they can say hello to Neil. I thought he was working, but it looks like he's joining us as well. Yeah, it's going to be a long night for you, but I do love having you kneel at my feet, so that's great. In any case, here are these workmen in Poland. They're using bulldozers. They're trying, what they want to do is to build a solar farm on this land. And as they're bulldozing the ground, they run into some hard rocks and they start trying to dig out these rocks, and they pretty soon realize that the rocks are actually arranged in a line and that they have discovered a buried wall. And as they dig further, they realize that it's an entire room below the ground. Ultimately, they figure out that it is the basement of a building that no longer exists and that they didn't know was there. And they're very annoyed because now, in order to complete their work, they're going to have to dig out this whole basement. And so they go to work with the bulldozers and then, with picks and so forth. And as they pull out the stones, they see engravings on those stones. And they very quickly realize that this basement was built from gravestones that were taken from a Jewish cemetery. For many of you, it will be no surprise that this is not some isolated incident. We know that during the war, the Nazis raided Jewish cemeteries for stones for many purposes. They were used to build an airfield landing strip, for example, for the Nazi soldiers. After the war, we know that so many Jews had died or decamped to the US or Israel or wherever, that those communities in Poland were really hollowed out, and there were very few people left to protect the cemeteries and to maintain them. It's not any surprise that as a result of that, bad things happened. Those high quality stones that were used, that were headstones, were raided from the cemeteries, and they were used to build roads and steps and garden walks. I have some family in Poland, and when I was visiting them several years ago, we took their children to a local park, and my my stepson pointed out to me an area in the park where the steps leading up to the playground had Jewish letters engraved on them. And he said they built these steps out of Jewish gravestones, and it's something that happened all over Poland. And at the time, that was really shocking for me. But it happened, and so many of those cemeteries were really decimated. And then, nature itself did terrible damage. Literally thousands of cemeteries just disappeared under decades of weeds and vines and trees because there was no one there to take care of them. One of the stories that I did not put into the article was the story of a city park in Ukraine where they had simply removed all of the gravestones and built a park right over the cemetery. Because they hadn't excavated it, the land itself was still pristine. The bodies were still there underground, but there were no gravestones. Later, they discovered a road that had been paved with those gravestones. Fortunately, a nonprofit organization in Ukraine was able to negotiate with the city so that eventually they were able to build a wall around the part of the park where the cemetery had been. They were able to put up markers, and they also excavated all of the gravestones from the road and had it repaved, and they were able to restore the gravestones, at least to that part of the cemetery. But obviously this was a horrible situation throughout Europe. And during the period after the war, where so many governments in Europe were communist governments, there was not a lot happening. The Jews were gone. There was no protection there for the cemeteries. But starting in the 1990s, really after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the failure of some of those communist governments, there was a big effort started to relocate, rediscover, and restore the cemeteries. I interviewed a woman named Ruth Ellen Gruber, who runs an excellent website that I would recommend to anyone. It's called Jewish Heritage Europe. And she described to me the sort of general awakening that happened in the early 90s. She said, people wanted to fill in the blank spaces, and Jewish heritage was one of those spaces. And so the good news for the cemeteries is that today there are a lot of people and organizations and institutions that are really working hard to find the cemeteries and to restore them. And I'll say later a little bit more about what it actually means to restore a cemetery, because there are different ways to do it and different thoughts about what actually should happen. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Myrna's story. And again, I wish she were here to tell you herself, but I'll do my best. So Myrna was a high school art teacher in Virginia, and she also taught some college art classes until one day, one of her high school students came to school brandishing a gun. And Myrna said, "That's it. I'm done with teaching high school. I'm out of here." So she found a job at the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk. And that led to other museum positions. And eventually it led to a doctorate in art history. Now, since she was a teenager, Myrna had had a deep fascination with cemeteries. this is another anecdote that didn't make it into the story, but I thought it was cute. She said her interest in cemeteries really started when she was 15 years old, and her father took her to practice parallel parking. And he decided that the best place to do that would be in the parking lot of the cemetery, because he said, at least you won't be able to kill anybody. So thank you for laughing. So after the lesson, her father took a nap in the car and she went for a walk in the cemetery. And, she walked around, she was reading the markers, and she said, I knew behind every one of those markers, there was someone's life. Cemeteries really came to be an outdoor museum for her. She said, for every work of art, there is a backstory. And the same is true for every gravestone in a cemetery. So that was really an interest of hers. And she also, during her lifetime, was very interested in genealogy and was trying to follow her family's history. And so at the age of 80, not that that's old, she decided to celebrate her birthday by going to an international genealogy conference in Warsaw, and to follow up that conference with a visit to her family's cemetery in a Polish town. And apologies for all of my terrible pronunciations of these names, but Goniec. And so it was all great. Her sister was with her. They went to the conference. They hired a driver. They drove to this little town. She said it was absolutely beautiful. The town square was picturesque. There was a little farm stand. There was no Starbucks, no gas station. It was really beautiful until they actually arrived at the cemetery. And she was absolutely appalled by what she found. She said, could this possibly be the Jewish cemetery? It was completely overgrown. There were vines taller than she was. There were trees. The gravestones were cracked and overturned. And she was just horrified. And she said, who's responsible for this? This is a shanda. And that was the beginning of her journey to clean up a single cemetery in Poland. Of course, there are an estimated 11,000 Jewish cemeteries in Europe, and many of them are still undiscovered since the war, and many more are discovered, they're known, but they are unrestored. So it's a big job that's out there. There's another story included in the article that I think illustrates some really important themes. Back in 2003, there was an observant Jew in Muncie. His name was Aharon Friedman, and he was getting older and he was feeling frail and he was starting to think about his own burial, and all of that led to thinking about his family and the cemetery where his parents were buried, which was in Ukraine. He had the name of the town, but nobody knew of a Jewish cemetery in that town. And he had left as a small child. So not a small child, but as a child. And he didn't have a lot of specific memories about anything in the town. But he really wanted to try to find the cemetery. He and his family were directed to a nonprofit, an organization known as Avoisenu, or the Heritage Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Cemeteries. So they contacted this organization, and his son-in-law told me later, he said, we called Avoisenu and they sent a young man with a notebook. And this young man interviewed Aharon, and he was able to describe his childhood memories of funerals. He was able to remember following a horse and buggy that carried the casket through a village, up a mountain, across the train tracks, up another mountain. It was all just sort of general information like this that he was able to offer. And listening to his description, his son-in-law and the rest of his family thought there is no chance that they're ever going to figure this out. Well, unfortunately, Aharon passed away shortly after that interview. But many months later, the family was very surprised to hear from Avoisenu, who in fact had contacted their people on the ground in Ukraine. They had given them the details from the interview, and they had actually been able to find the cemetery, which was a miracle in itself. So the way that this organization works is that they start with, they're a nonprofit, they're based in New York, but they have a lot of contacts in a variety of countries in Eastern Europe. They start with requests from descendants. They go to look on the ground, they find the cemetery, they do an evaluation, they determine if it needs to be restored, if it's possible to be restored, and if so, the approximate size of the cemetery, and that determines the cost of the restoration. So in this case, they estimated for Aharon's family, there were about 50 graves in this cemetery, and they gave them a price, because the way this organization works is that the family who requests the restoration pays for it, and the cost is based on the size. And the organization also does a ton of fundraising to cover their other basic costs, but the hard costs of the restoration are with the families. So they said there are about 50 graves. So the family pays them. They begin to do the restoration, and the more they dig up the weeds and the vines and take out the trees, the bigger this cemetery gets. And they keep working and working, and there are years of work, and additional money is paid over the years, and they're uncovering more and more graves, and they still haven't found the Friedman's graves, but they keep working at it. And finally, after years of work, the cemetery turns out to have 350 graves. And literally the last two that they find are Aharon Friedman's grandfather, father and grandfather. So the family was, ecstatic. This was like really exciting for them. And I think there are a couple of lessons from this, one of which is the restoration of a cemetery is not the end, because there has to be continued maintenance. You can clear away trees, but one hot summer and the weeds start to grow back. And any of us who've done lawn work understand how that works. So there has to be some sustainable plan for each cemetery. The way Avoisenu works is that the family pays or sets up a fund, in some way, but there has to be an annual fee for the maintenance. So that is one way to do cemetery restoration. The other way is Dr. Tech's way, Myrna's way. And that is what I call sweat equity and stakeholder engagement. Basically you connect with the people in the town. You also connect with every relative you have, and every friend you have, and everyone else you can think of who might be willing to toss a couple pennies in the pot to pay for this, for the restoration. And then you make plans and you fly over there and you spend a day or a week or 2 weeks with your lopper and your shears, clearing space in this cemetery. So Dr. Tech actually did this one summer. She was very, very persistent and smart about being able to connect with the mayor of the town, with others in the local community who wanted to see the cemetery cleaned up. They organized, they did a really good job of clearing one portion of that cemetery, but she has a lot of work left to be done. She had hoped to go back last summer to do more work. That didn't happen. I connected with her earlier today, and she told me she won't be going back this summer either. But she's got some other good news. There is still hope that they're going to continue that work. One of the people that she has connected with, I think, is another really interesting piece of the story. This is a Baptist minister named Stephen Reese. He's based now in Atlanta. but he spent about 10 years actually working in Poland. And while he was in Poland, he became familiar with this issue of disappearing cemeteries. Yes, exactly, Marcia. He is the person who started the Matseva Foundation. And his goal is twofold. One, he says he wants to educate Christians about the Holocaust, and he's looking for some kind of reconciliation between Jews and Christians. And so he's undertaken this work over the last decade or so. He has recruited more than 1,000 volunteers who've actually gone to cities in Europe to work on cemetery projects there. He's tried to do 3 to 7 projects every summer. And again, he was also put on pause last year, but his work is continuing. And I thought it was just a really fascinating slice of this story, that there was a Baptist minister who was so deeply immersed in the work, and that his work is continuing. Another person who had worked with Pastor Reese is Hattie Bledger. She is a linguist, also a PhD, and she worked on a cemetery where she believes her ancestors are buried in Szarosz, Poland. The most interesting thing about her experience that I found was that although she was working literally in the cemetery during the day with, all of the tools in the heat of the day, putting in that sweat equity, they were taking photographs of the gravestones. And then at night, in a hotel room, a group of them would gather, decipher the names and the dates from those gravestones, and working with a database in Poland, were able to connect the gravestones with the vital records from the actual people, with the idea that they are beginning to build a directory of the cemetery, which I think is, it's super valuable. And it's one of the ways that advocates are able to enhance the restoration of a cemetery, to determine who is actually buried there. There are a couple more things that I want to touch on. I wonder, though, if I should pause for a minute. I'm going to just check the chat to see if there are any specific questions. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but I wonder if anyone online has anything immediately that they wanted to ask or comments. Yes, Steve.
You just alluded to something that I was wondering about during your initial presentation. Mm-hmm. Is there any way to actually connect the stones that have been found in various condition and places with actual grave sites? And then you just made a mention of that. Is there's certainly not going to be doing DNA on remains, but is there any map or chart, as they do today in today's modern cemeteries, of where people were buried? Can they connect the headstones to the graves?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's multi-layered, right? Because first of all, it's going to depend on the cemetery. In most cases, there is no paper record left of who was in that cemetery, just because of all the time that has passed and the fact that it hasn't been maintained. But they are trying to do work like Hattie Bledger's work, looking at gravestones, tying them to vital records to see who lived in the town, and figure it out that way. There also are, for example, one of the organizations that I connected with during the reporting is a Polish organization, the one whose acronym is FUDGE. Their goal, as I had mentioned, is to find new ways, new lives for Jewish institutional buildings. So, for example, a former synagogue in a town that doesn't really have a Jewish community anymore might become a community center for the whole community, etc. Part of the job of the fudge director, Peter Pukta, is, he gets calls from all over Poland. We found some gravestones. What should we do with them? And part of his job is to try to connect those gravestones with their most likely burial places. So in the opening anecdote, when I talked about the basement in the field, he was the one who got that call, and he had to figure out first what cemetery they had come from, which I think was pretty obvious because of the nature of the geography. But then he also had to figure out logistically, how do I get these heavy gravestones back to the cemetery? So that's a whole separate layer for him. And then, and maybe the rabbis can help me out here, there are rules about what you can and cannot do with gravestones in a cemetery. And different flavors of Judaism that follow those rules, I think, in different ways. So even, for example, Avoseinu, they will go in and pick up headstones that have fallen and replace them in the most likely spot where they actually should go. And so, so you can find, I'm going to see if I can share a picture. So this gives you an example of one cemetery before it's been obviously restored. Hang on, I'm moving you over so I can do a switch. Here's some folks actually working in a cemetery, and I'm looking for a picture that shows one of the Avoseinu cemeteries, and I'm not immediately finding it, but they will actually reset the headstones. Others who are restoring cemeteries don't feel that that is appropriate under Jewish law. And again, Rabbi Gila or Rabbi Susan, I don't know if either of you have any insight into the differences there. But in some cases, I know that they just leave the headstones where they are because they don't feel it's right to reset them.
Is that because they're not sure where the right place is for them?
Well, I don't know. One of the folks I spoke to told me that if a gravestone is cracked, you're not supposed to repair it. So that's part of it. A lot of times when they fall over, they're cracked or actually in more than one piece. And so it's not appropriate to put it back together.
Huh.
So thank you. That was a great question, Steve.
I have a rudimentary little bit of knowledge about that. A man from here in town, Jerry Klinger, was instrumental several years ago in having Herzl's grandson moved from Addis Israel Congregation Cemetery here in Washington to Mount Herzl. It's a whole story, and if you're not familiar with it, we could discuss it another time. But Jerry was a friend, and I was actually
Is a friend.
is a friend, and I was at it's Stephen Norman was the grandson, and this Stefan Nachman, who ended up getting out before, and his parents did not. They perished, but he went to Britain, and sadly, he also committed suicide here in Washington, D.C., but that's all part of a bigger story. But Sue and I were at that gravesite before the body was exhumed and moved to Israel. And the headstone was an issue. I don't know the whole story intimately, only rudimentary knowledge, but the headstone is something that I can address because it was massive in weight, absolutely massive in weight. And in order to dig into the grave, it also was damaged by falling over. And they really wanted to take it to Israel, but Mount Herzl has its own requirements for headstones for up there. So it was determined the thing to do was bury it back in the place where the grave was. So it went back into the ground. But I can't imagine.
Very messy, very quickly.
Yeah, I can't imagine that it would even be doable to lift all of these very heavy stones that have gone all over this. And then one last thing I'll mention is there was a story this week on local news about headstones that were discovered 60 miles downriver in Virginia from a Black cemetery that was destroyed in Northeast Washington. So the headstone issue seems to be a lot more involved than just this European one. And one last mention, the first time I ever heard of this concept of bad people doing bad things to Jewish cemeteries, I must have been naive to not know that it's probably gone on throughout history. But on my first trip to Israel, I was on the Mount of Olives, and our tour guide showed us where Jewish headstones had been used by the Arabs in the 19 years between independence and 1967, when we took it all back, and was turned into roadways and toilets on the Mount of Olives by the Jordanian people that controlled the land at the time. So this thing about desecration of Jewish headstones is such a multi-layered story.
Yes.
And that's all I can share right now. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you for that. Marcia, did you have a question?
Oh, I was going to respond with another place you can possibly find information on who belongs where. On Jewish Gen, also Yad Vashem, and what's the name of the collection in Europe? I can't remember the name. They are digitizing Yizkor books. So the communities that survived, when they managed to make it to safety in some way, they gathered all of their recollections and copied down the names, places, people,
Right.
their heritage, their history, what their town looked like, if they could find any photographs, all of that. And you can find one of the ones that's in my family, it actually has addresses of where they found that people had gone to afterward. So you could possibly track somebody down. So I would say that's probably your best bet.
Yeah, fascinating.
If you're looking for more, because that's the most concrete place you're going to find paperwork, so to speak,
Right.
for where people were, unfortunately.
Yeah, makes sense.
When Marcia, what you'd mentioned about Jewish Gen,
Yes.
the Yizkor books were generally written in Yiddish or Hebrew. However, Jewish Gen has one of their many projects is translating them into English, and there
Yep.
are a number of those books that are in English. But speaking also of Jewish Gen, Linda, do you know if any of these graves that have been identified are in what they call Jober, which is a something from Jewish Gen also, which lists all the cemeteries and names of people and grave sites, and that's not necessarily Europe. I mean, that's the United States also. So if they find out any names, I would hopefully that they would put it there. There is this International Jewish Cemetery project, which I'm not sure is tied into, any of these.
It is actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, there is, I'm pulling out my cheat sheet.
Oh.
Which is the actual article that appeared in print. There's the European Jewish Cemeteries Initiative, which is one of the many organizations that are, working to pull the information together. And you mentioned Jewish Gen. That is a great resource, and lots of the folks that I talked to not only had found additional family members that way, but had used it for fundraising and also for, as a resource for lots of other information. So that's really super helpful.
Yeah, I think that trip that you mentioned that Dr. Tech went to in Poland was the International Convention of the IAJGS, if I'm not mistaken.
The Jewish Genealogical Society.
Jewish Genealogical
Correct.
Societies.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. Any other questions or comments before I close?
These headstones, they were, I presume, generally made of a a hard material, say granite or marble, and so that weathering, you'd still be able to read a good number of them. I mean, I'm thinking of in the United States, colonial headstones were probably limestone and that, and after weathering, you can't read them. But I presume that these were, hard material that would have survived. Not the ones that were, used for roads and that, but the other ones that would have been.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. My sense is certainly that they were mostly granite or other hard stone. There have been times where the gravestones were just so weathered that they weren't readable, but in many cases they can actually, yeah.
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 May,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
may I ask a question?
Please.
Sorry, I'm not on video. But I was curious what the families that decide to do a restoration, what kind of cost that is.
Yeah, it can be very costly. I'm looking to see if I added that to my current notes because I don't think I put it directly in the story except for when Stephen Reese organizes a group to go over, he indicated to me that the cost of a project is about $2,500 for a 7 to 10 day project. And that doesn't count the travel costs or, lodging or any of that. That's just the cost of bringing in the equipment and clearing the cemetery and having all of the debris taken away, etc. So that's a piece of it. And I apologize, I do not have, I don't think I have handy my notes from my interview with Avoisenu, because they have some very specific costs for, it's kind of a per gravestone cost, and then there's an annual cost, as I said, to maintain it.
Who guarantees there will be somebody maintaining it? After the commitment is made, is there a local governing agency that will make certain?
Yeah, it's not a governing agency, but if you work through Avoisenu, they have people on the ground, and they actually send to whoever is paying the bill, they send pictures twice a year. This family that I interviewed had actually been back there several times, sometimes without notice. So they were very happy with the condition of the cemetery. Now,
Thank you.
is that a raised hand or?
The people working on these graves, I think we all know that there's still a lot of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and in Poland. So when they're working on the graves, do they have problems with anti-Semitism from the locals? The Christian locals, do you know?
The most successful projects work because they are able to connect with local people and help them understand that it's not just Jewish history in the cemetery, it's their own history. It's the history of their town. And, I can't generalize. I didn't talk to everybody, but the folks that I interviewed said that the local communities were very open to the idea of restoring the cemeteries. In many cases, they pitched in and helped. There were some communities where they instituted educational projects that involved school kids who actually went out and interviewed people who had memories of Jewish residents. So, obviously it's going to depend on the town, but in many cases, I think it's been a positive experience all the way around.
Question. Do they work in Romania? Do you know?
There are some groups that work in Romania. Yes.
I'd like to get that information from you offline. I will tell you, I went searching for family roots several years ago, and I had an ancestor who was prominent in part of Romania. He was the chief rabbi, and I knew where his grave was from, written stuff. And I got there. I know we're not screen sharing, but I don't know if you can see this picture. This is the chief rabbi's grave. It's just a bunch of trash.
Wow.
So I would love to get involved.
Show
And
it again, Natalie.
can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, just trash. And they didn't, and I talked to them and they just didn't care. Nobody cared. So I'd love to get it.
Yeah, Natalie, talk to Adrian. I'll make sure that she connects us via
Thank
email
you.
and I can get you the
Okay.
contact information. So I know we just have like a minute left. And I'll just close by following up with with one of the families to say that, sorry, I'm going to circle back to the Friedman family. This is the family that paid Avoiceno to restore their cemetery. The first lesson from them was that this isn't a one-time thing. You really have to keep maintaining the cemetery. But the second is that time is really not on the side of people trying to salvage desecrated or overgrown cemeteries. This family, as I said, had gone back several times to visit. And what they noticed the first time they went back is that the hillsides on either side of this cemetery were forested hillsides, just like theirs had been. But over the years, as they went back, they saw that those hills on either side had actually been planted with vegetables and had become parts of huge farms. And, they said, you just don't realize the risk is if you don't save it now, potentially it's going to be gone. And that was how I closed the story. And I think it's certainly food for thought for those of us and those of you who might be interested in getting involved in something like this.
A sober and final thought: who's going to restore King David in Virginia or Judean in Olney in 250, 300 years? I hope it doesn't come to that, but we really don't know. So
We don't know.
that's right.
Thank
I'm
you.
working on that one now, Steve.
Yeah. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Linda. This was
This was wonderful.
Thank you very much, Linda.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You were
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you. Thank
All of your
you. And
presentations
we
are-
even tolerated the kibitzer there.